Good evening. Welcome to Legally Speaking. I'm your host, Sophia Haynes. Today we're talking about educational neglect and truancy, and we have one of the foremost experts in that area with us here today, Mr. Robert James, the DeKalb District Attorney. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Just by way of introduction, Mr. James was sworn in as DeKalb County's DA in November of 2010. He oversees 155 employees and prosecutes over 8,000 cases per year. He's a career prosecutor who has started several innovative programs, one being Valerie to combat elder and adult abuse, Jobs Not Jail, and one thing that we'll talk about tonight, Project Perfect Attendance, that outlines that whole educational neglect, truancy issue, just to name a few. So, welcome again, Mr. James. Got a couple of stats that I want to start off with.
Shoot.
I think we all heard them all. Half of all dropouts, ages 16 to 24, are unemployed. High school dropouts earn an average of $270,000 less than graduates over the course of their lives. In Georgia, 88% of all prison inmates are high school dropouts. 9% of DeKalb County inmates never obtain their high school diploma. Does it surprise you that there's a correlation, it appears, between crime and lack of education?
Not at all. Education is the vehicle through which our children and even adults attain the promises of the American dream. And I guess the reverse of that is when one is not educated, they're much more likely to be susceptible to all of the aforementioned statistics that you mentioned, whether it's being incarcerated or being chronically impoverished, poor, what have you.
So why do you think they fall back to crime as the fail-safe?
Well, there's a direct correlation between employment and an individual that's either in jail or out of jail. We know that people that are unemployed are much more likely, when I say unemployed, I mean chronically unemployed or underemployed, are much more likely to commit crimes and be incarcerated. Well, if you take things a step further, if an individual is not educated, then they're not going to be able to be employed. And that's just the way it is.
And why do you think we have this whole problem with chronic unemployment or underemployment?
Well, we have in some ways we have an insufficient education system in some of our areas. Some of our areas the education system is quite good, but in some neighborhoods and in some communities the education system isn't that good. But even before you get to the quality of the education system, the quality of what's going on at home, parents ensuring that their children take advantage of what's being provided to them for free, a public education, that's just not there in a lot of communities. In a lot of communities, education isn't valued. And again, it all goes back to education. If our children are not educated, then they're not going to be employed. We know, particularly our young men, when they're unemployed or underemployed chronically, they're much more likely to be arrested or incarcerated over a long period of time.
And in your practice, have you found it to be a generational issue, or is it some type of anomaly?
Well, it's sort of interesting. I wouldn't call it generational. I think every generation has struggled with education. I do think, however, that what is unique to this generation, particularly with with the minority population, whether you're talking about African Americans or Hispanics or what have you, is that education isn't as valued perhaps as much as it was by this generation as it was the generation before. I think there was a generation that came before us that understood that the way that you got out of poverty, the way that you attained all the promises of the Bill of Rights, the way that you became equal in this country, was to make sure that you were educated and you could afford to do the things that our forefathers marched and died for.
Absolutely.
Without that education, it's out there, but you can never get to it.
So why do you think the shift happened between the focus on the education? Because sometimes we hear it's maybe things become too easy, and education has become as much of a priority. Do you think that has something to do with it?
I really don't know. There are a lot of things, and this is a lot deeper than just the law. You're talking about sociology, you're talking about economics, you're talking about culture to a great deal. I just know that there has been a shift. There's been a breakdown of the family, over the last 30 years, and our families aren't as intact as they were at one point. And that's not just the nuclear family, but that's the extended family as well, isn't there. People are having children younger, and so you have grandparents that are in their 30s now. And I think values aren't what they used to be. I heard a man say one time, you have to keep the main thing the main thing. Well, the main thing is education and raising children. And oftentimes, the young men and women that I see coming through the criminal justice system, not only are they uneducated or undereducated, they don't have any skill set, even if they do have a high school diploma, but many of them don't. But also, they haven't had an adult impart those values to them that you and I may have had.
Absolutely. Now, prior to being DA, you were the Solicitor General.
I was.
And it seems like that we saw a thrust of that. It was that if you didn't go to school, then you might see Robert James come around the corner. So what caused you to take this issue on by the horns?
Tired of putting kids in jail. Period, point blank, end of story. Tired of walking into a courtroom. When I was solicitor, my jurisdiction was 17 and above, seeing 17, 18, and 19-year-olds that were either going to jail or that were going to plead guilty or be convicted and receive their first criminal conviction. And, we talked about employment earlier. Once you get that first criminal conviction, it is extremely difficult to get hired by someone. McDonald's doesn't even want you if you've got a shoplifting, or misdemeanor theft or misdemeanor drug crime. And so it's difficult. And so one of the things that we thought about was if we can force in some small way, we're not naive, but in some small way, if we can force parents to be accountable for their children, just that one shift, just that one move could mean the difference in between a child going to college or going to prison.
So did you get any pushback? So I take that means yes.
Yeah, it was more pushback than I've ever gotten on anything in my life. And I think that was the most shocking and the most disappointing thing initially. I got pushback from several radio stations, from several periodicals, from several on-air personalities. I was called everything from a cowboy to the new sheriff Jesse James, but it wasn't a compliment the way that they were using it. And I don't think people understand. We call it educational neglect. Emphasis on the word neglect. People like to use the word truancy. Well, that's when the child is just laying out on their own. But when your child is 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 years old and they've missed 50 days from school or 60 days from school or 90 or in some cases a year or two out of school,
that's ridiculous.
That's neglect. That's neglect. And and as an elected official that is sworn to enforce the laws, in the county, if I'm not stepping in and doing something, then I'm not doing my job, and I'm guilty of neglect as well.
So let's talk about that, what the differences are. Because we hear educational neglect and truancy. So could you tell our audience what is the difference? Truancy
is the delinquent act, as it were. And we use the word delinquent act because, if you're talking about a juvenile, it's not technically a crime for the most part. There's some exceptions, but we won't get into that here. Truancy is the delinquent act that a child commits when that child willfully lays out of school. And you see that addressed in juvenile court. And, you've heard that term for 20, 30, 40, 50 years now. Truancy, truancy, truancy. Well, there's a new trend where people are starting to say, well, okay, well, that's, we understand that the child is truant and the child is laying out of school. But if that child is under 13, because, when the child gets around 13, 14, and 15, it gets complicated. Who's at fault? Mama or the child? But when that child is 11, 10, 9 years old, he or she can't drive themselves to school.
Absolutely.
So who's really at fault?
Exactly.
Because mama and daddy, you have to be accountable for your child. The child didn't ask to come here. You brought him here. And that's where truancy, it goes from truancy to educational neglect, when the accountability, the responsibility is on the parent's shoulders and they're not living up to that. And that's what we call educational neglect.
Okay, so could you tell our audience what exactly is the law as it pertains to school attendance?
Sure. If your child misses 5 days, 5 unexcused days of school, at that point, the solicitor or the DA or the relevant prosecuting authority, law enforcement authority in that jurisdiction, have the ability to prosecute. Now, in DeKalb County, we never got involved at 5 days. It always had to be more than that, but the law allows us to get involved at 5 days. There are things involved in the law like sending a letter, like sending a notice, making sure that the parent is aware that their child is out of school. The law goes further and says that you have to be able to prove that it is the parent's fault. And so it provides sort of a defense to the parents in saying that either I didn't know my child was missing school or it's not my fault. So this is not just an automatic thing. We lawyers call it strict liability. It's not just an automatic thing where your child misses 5 days. Gotcha. you're going to jail, or gotcha, you're going to be fined. What it is it allows us to start an investigation, and if it is your fault, then we can hold you accountable. But if it's your child's fault, or if the school wasn't making you aware your child was out of school, then we're not able to prosecute you, and social services and social workers and all that is more appropriate and not a courtroom.
Okay, so let's take a step back. So that would tend to mean that there is a compulsory rule that you have to attend school in the beginning. So is there a certain age range where...
You're asking me about compulsory attendance. Every child in the state of Georgia between the ages of 6 and 16 has to be in school. Absolutely, 100% has to be in school. If a child that is 5 years old and starts kindergarten, and I don't remember the exact number of days, but if that child is going to school regularly, once they start going to school regularly, they can't just pull out of kindergarten. But a 5-year-old doesn't have to be in school if they don't start attending in the first place. But once a child turns 6 years old, they have to be in school all the way up until the point that they're 16. At 16, you can become an emancipated minor. You can go and fill out paperwork, and as long as the parent signs off on it, the child can legally drop out of school. Now, in fact, we see children dropping out as young as 12, 13, and 14.
Absolutely, yes.
But legally, they're not entitled to drop out until they're 16.
So at 16, from what I'm hearing you say, the parent has to have some type of agreement for them to step out, or can the children just say, I'm 16, I'm not going anymore, Mom?
The parent has to sign off on it. It works just like in juvenile court, again, what we call the emancipated minor process, where there has to be some due process involved. You have to get paperwork signed. You have to go to the school. But the 16-year-old just can't say, I'm 16, I'm grown, I'm free, I will not return to school. That's not the way it works.
So what can a parent do if I have a child that says, I'm 16, I'm not going to school anymore?
Well, there are all sorts of alternatives. Because we see this a lot of times. We see a 16-year-old, and frankly, the 16-year-old is falling behind academically, and they're on a 9th grade level or an 8th grade level, and they're getting ready to go to the 10th grade, but they're 16 in the 8th grade. We've seen that. And traditional school perhaps isn't best for your child. You've got all sorts of alternative schools. You've got all sorts of separate academies and things like that, where the child can take advantage of education and still finish their education, but they're not going to be 16 with 13-year-olds. And you see a lot of that. But a parent does have, the right to make sure that their child is continuing to be educated up until the point, I believe it's up until the point of either 18 or 19 under state law.
So does a parent have any recourse if the child says, I don't want to do any of those alternative programs?
Yes.
So what can a parent do to ensure that their child completes that education?
They can make them continue to go, and if the child refuses, you have juvenile court options. Nobody ever wants to go there, obviously, because you're getting the courthouse involved in your family, but that is an option.
That is
but the child just can't look you in the face and tell you, I'm 16 and I'm not going to school anymore. That is not an option. The parent has to be involved in that dropout process for the child that is 16. Now, in fact, it doesn't always work that way, because the reality is that a lot of these children that are dropping out at 16 were habitually truant or habitually absent from school at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. The level of concern coming from the parent was less than spectacular or less than overwhelming. And so when the child reaches 16 and the child decides not to go to school anymore, in fact, what happens is that oftentimes the parent is sort of like, well, they're 16 and I can't do anything about it. The school, and you're familiar with No Child Left Behind and AYP, Adequate Yearly Progress, the schools oftentimes, I don't want to say they want the 16-year-old gone, because I don't think any teacher wants a child gone, but there's not a weeping when a child walks out that is actually pulling down adequate yearly progress because of their test scores and because of their attendance. And those are factors that factor into it.
Okay. We've got a lot of information. We're going to take a break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about essentially what is the potential punishment if a parent decides to not comply, and for parents that want to handle this problem, what can we do to help them out?
Sure.
We'll be back in a couple of moments. Hi, you're tuned into Legally Speaking, a public service of You and the Law. You and the Law is a nonprofit whose mission is to provide information and resources to empower you in your legal affairs. If you have a question or would like to have a topic featured, feel free to contact us online at www.youandthelawtoday.org. You can also sign up there for our mailing list and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We air a new show every Sunday at 6 o'clock, so make sure you tune in to see the new featured show. And remember, with every right comes responsibilities, so know your rights and accept your responsibilities. Welcome back. We're talking to DeKalb District Attorney Robert James about educational neglect and truancy within our Back to School series that we're having here on Legally Speaking. Now, before we left to the break, Mr. James, we were talking about exactly what educational neglect and truancy was. And you mentioned that after 5 unexcused absences, we're looking at a potential prosecution for not sending that child to school. Could you tell us basically what potential sentence could a parent be involved in or have for not sending their kids to school if they're found guilty of educational neglect?
Well, technically, each day after 5 unexcused absences is an offense. It's a misdemeanor, and I believe the sentence is, I want to say it's 30 days for each day, either 30 days or 6 months. I don't remember off the top of my head. I know it's not a full year for every day, but the reality is that those days add up and those days stack. And so when I was running the solicitor's office and we were dealing with educational neglect, oftentimes we would stack days not necessarily for the purpose of incarceration, but for the purposes of probation. And so we would have the parents under a probated period where we could actually deal with some of the issues that they had. I believe there's also a $100 fine involved for each separate offense as well.
So if my child misses 5 days in school, I'm looking at 30 days for each day, so for 150 days.
Beyond the 5 days.
Beyond the 5 days.
5 days is a threshold. Once you get beyond the 5 days, that's when it starts becoming technically criminal. And so anything beyond, you won't be punished for those first 3, 4, 5 days, but when you get beyond the 5 days, everything after that is a crime. So
we could potentially look at some serious time if we had a very zealous person that didn't understand probation and retribution, well, rehabilitation. I mean,
and it's funny that you say that because because when I was running the solicitor's office, we had something called the START program, which is the Student Teacher Attendance Review Team.
And I want to talk to you about that. Tell us about START.
Well, START is a very intelligent way to go about diversion. Diversion is essentially a second chance program. You're looking at a school system the size of DeKalb County. It's got between 99,000 and 100,000 children. You're going to have a large population of those kids that are going to miss. Our threshold was 8 days. We didn't go by the 5 days. We gave parents a little bit more leeway. A lot of kids, perhaps thousands of kids a year that are going to miss at least 8 days of school. Can't prosecute all of them.
That is true.
Cannot prosecute all of them. We don't have the money, the time, or the courtroom space, and I didn't have the prosecutors. And so we started a program where we could bring between 8 and 12 days almost all of these cases in and actually run them through a second chance program. The parents would come in, they would sign a contract saying that their children were going to be in school going forward. We would have social workers and counselors from the school system in the room, and you may have as many as 300 or 400 parents in the room. They go in alphabetical order. They sit down with the social worker. They sit down with the counselor, and they work out a plan going forward to make sure that their child is in school. And what we would do is we would monitor it over the course of the next 3 quarters. As long as there was no more significant absences or anything of that nature, as long as the child was doing well academically in school, we never prosecuted them. For the parents that didn't show up at the meeting or for the parents that just failed to comply during that process, that's when we would actually come in and start prosecuting. So in terms of our educational neglect court, where we're actually prosecuting parents, you may see 15, 20, 25 parents per session, which is not that many at all. But if you go to our START meetings, you see 300, 350 parents. Doing things that way, you actually affect the bottom line when it comes to truancy and educational neglect in the school system. Because we had about an 85-90% success rate, meaning 85 to 90% of those 300 people that came through did not reoffend. We did not have to prosecute them. And so the net result is that more kids are in school in DeKalb County and is actually manageable for me as a prosecutor.
So you had all those people with kids with 8 unexcused absences? Between
8 and 12. Once they got beyond 12, at that point, between 12 and 15, depending on the circumstances, we were transferring it to educational neglect court and making a decision to prosecute. The reason being is that 2 things. Number one, once a child misses 15 days of school, unexcused or excused, it counts against AYP for the school and the school system.
Okay.
Number two, you're talking about almost a month educationally, because there are only 5 days in a school week. That's 3-4 weeks of school. Kids are only in school about 9 months a year, 8.5, 9 months a year. You miss a month out of a school year. How is that child going to perform when it comes to standardized tests? When it comes to getting their homework? That child is already behind. That child is already in crisis when you're at the 15-day mark. And so that was when we felt like a stronger intervention was necessary, and we actually prosecuted the case.
So how does the homeschool program factor in, or if it does? And I'm pretty sure you heard a lot of people saying, well, I'm homeschooling. And that's why my kid went in school. I'm homeschooling. That's what it was.
As long as you sign up, it's none of my business. As long as you sign up with the school system, they give you homework, they give you guidelines, they give you rules. You go down to the school system, you sign up. That is none of my business. The only thing that is my business are unexcused absences.
Okay.
Legally unexcused absences.
So I can't self-declare I'm a homeschooler.
You cannot self-declare. And oftentimes what we would see on the extreme cases where children would be out of school for 2 years, parents would say, well, I'm homeschooling. And we gave them the benefit of the doubt. My deputy chief, Haynes O'Reilly, a lot of times she would go in and she would say, okay, so, you say you're homeschooling. We're going to go out, we're going to look at the books, we're going to look at the plan, we're going to look at what you're doing, and if in fact you are teaching, we're not going to prosecute you. We'll hold this case for 30 days for you to go get signed up. And as long as you get signed up, we're out of your life. Because our intent was not to penalize parents that were doing what they were supposed to do, even though they weren't comporting with every single aspect of the law. However, the vast majority of cases that we saw where parents said they were homeschooling, we would go out to the house
and didn't find a book.
Couldn't find a book, couldn't find a scrap of paper, couldn't find a crayon, a pencil, or anything, and the neighbors would tell us, oh yeah, that child plays in the yard all day, So, and we saw several cases where parents were homeschooling, and they didn't even have GEDs themselves.
Begs the question of what we're learning. So tell me about Project Perfect Attendance.
Well, Project Perfect Attendance is essentially the big picture of what I've been describing here. It involves on the front end, a start type program, like a diversion program where you bring, I call it the wide mouth of the funnel, where the majority of kids are brought in. And we've described that. The second phase of Project Perfect Attendance of what you're talking about is essentially Educational Neglect Court, which is the enforcement prong. Because none of that works if you're not enforcing the laws. And parents don't go to jail immediately. And by the way, a lot of folks talked about us putting parents in jail. The reality is that less than 1% of the parents we dealt with or came in contact with ever spent a day in jail. But the derelict parents during the enforcement prong oftentimes do go to jail. But during the probation period, you see us making parents go to PTSA meetings, us making parents, interact with their children's teachers, check homework, all the things a good parent should do. I mean, maybe I'm a bad person for making parents be good parents, but all the
somebody need to help them out.
All the things they should be doing anyway. There was a publicity or PR prong to it, because I'm a firm believer that if the world doesn't know that this is a consequence in what you're doing, that you're not going to change behavior. And there was also a mentoring component as well, which is big, because we can only do so much by enforcing the law and cracking the whip, as it were, with mama and daddy. You have to get inside of the life of the child, because some of these kids around 12, 13, 14, and 15 have problems beyond, just not passing in school and not attending, and their behavior in schools. Some of them have been abused, some of them have been neglected, some of them have issues because, a lot of the young men, have never been taught how to be a man by another man, and so part of what we started doing was engaging mentoring associations and organizations to actually get inside of the lives of these individuals. And so Project Perfect Attendance is a holistic approach to a very narrow but big problem.
So have you seen any effect of these programs on the cases that you're prosecuting?
Yes, we have.
Tell us about it.
We've seen effects on an individual level and on a system-wide level as well. On an individual level, we've seen several cases. There was one young woman that came through the court, and she was an exotic dancer, when her children weren't in school, and I believe, she went back to school, and she started, I think she may even be in the medical industry, nursing and things of that nature. We've seen parents come back and thank us for making them be responsible for their kids. On a system-wide level, there was a 25% 25% increase in attendance after 4 years of this program.
Oh, that's great. So, just to recap a little bit, because my producer's over there dancing, to make sure we're running out of time. It's been excellent. As a parent, before I get into the situation where I'm being prosecuted, what type of notification should I have received?
Well, you should have received a letter from the social worker or from the counselor at the school. First of all, the school has a protocol where they send out 3 and 5 day letters. Mm-hmm. Second of all, you should have received a letter from the solicitor's office telling you to come to start before you get prosecuted. And so there are things that are going to happen before you get prosecuted. But as a parent, if you're engaged with the counselors and the teachers at the school, then it's never going to happen to you, because if your child is out of school, you're going to know it.
And that leads into my next question. So how can I, as a parent or a community member, how to combat truancy and educational neglect?
Well, you can be in constant contact with your children's teachers, with the principal, with the assistant principal, with the counselors. You can use parent portal, which is what they have at the DeKalb County school system, and you can track attendance online and find out if your child went to this period, in that period, and if your child even skipped a period.
So tell us, what is Parent Portal?
It's an online system that the DeKalb County school system has that allows you to track your child from classroom to classroom.
So do I get information about this when I register my kids?
You should. It should be in your packet, yes.
So that means parents need to read the packets, huh?
Parents need to read the packets. Parents need to engage the school system, and as long as they do that, their children will do fine. When parents are disengaged, that's when all these sorts of things happen.
So where can I get more information about educational neglect and truancy?
Well, you can go to the DeKalb County Solicitor General's website. It's one place. Mm-hmm. Another place, you can communicate with the school system. There's a lot of information online about that. If you just Google truancy or educational neglect, there's a lot of information online about it. We work with DFACs in extreme cases, and so that's another resource. There's several resources out there.
Okay, is there anywhere I can go to find out any particular protocols for DeKalb, or are they all pretty uniform across the line?
Well, the law is uniform around the state. Mm-hmm. However, DeKalb has its own protocol, and you can engage the DeKalb County school system if you want that protocol. Quentin Fretwell is over student affairs, and he would have it in his office.
Great. Excellent information. You heard it here, folks. Educational neglect and truancy is a problem that we need to tackle so that we don't have issues in the criminal justice system. This whole month has been our Back to School series, where we're trying to educate you on making sure that you understand your rights and responsibilities as far as the law is concerned with your children. So make sure you join us next week, same time, same station. And remember, with every right comes responsibility. Know your rights, accept your responsibilities. Thank you, Mr. James.
Thank you.
You have to come back and see us.
Anytime.
All right.